Stop and introduce Carol. We're very fortunate to have her here today. She's the Leo Pasvolsky Senior Fellow at Brookings, and also is a professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and is a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor, IZA, which I've never heard of. Is it here?
It's in Bonn, but it's an international network of labor.
Okay. In fact, I've spoken with her. But it has, there's an affiliated group that's, I didn't realize it was the same place in Bonn. I've been there, done that. She's author of The Pursuit of Happiness to an Economy of Well-Being, published by Brookings recently. She's also authored Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires. I wonder who thought of that yet. And many other books I won't list here. She's also the author of articles in journals including Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the World Bank, Research Observer, Health Affairs, Health Economics, the Journal of Socioeconomics, and on and on. Really a distinguished publishing record. She served as Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at Brookings from 2002 to 4. She's also served as a Special Advisor to the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and been a consultant of the IADB, the Inter-American Development Bank, UNDP, UN Development Program, and the Harvard Institute for International Development, and on and on. Her research has received support from Big Mac, as we say, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. I got a few issues around that. We'll leave that for later. The World Bank, the Inter-American Development, IDB again, and the Tinker and Hewlett Foundations. And she was awarded a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship in 1997-98 and served as Special Advisor to the Executive VP of the IADB. She's born in Lima, Peru. I like to hear that story. Born in Lima, Peru. Has an AB from Princeton, an MA from Johns Hopkins Science, which I learned we're both graduates of Science, different years, and a PhD from Oxford, the mother of 3 children. So with that, as a maybe too long introduction, but well-deserved, Carol, we'll be delighted to have you here, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I may just stand, because I can't see what I'm doing otherwise.
You can tell me to advance the slides.
So when I got this invitation, obviously I'm not an expert on environmental issues in any way, but I do think the metrics are relevant because they provide us ways to value the non-income dimensions of well-being in terms. Some people we have a way you can translate it into dollar terms if you want to. They're numbers that aren't all that incredible, but they give you a kind of relative valuation. But mainly, it's to introduce you to a whole new science of well-being measurement, which I think could be very useful in trying to demonstrate the effects of things like noise pollution on the well-being of particular neighborhoods, or climate change. I mean, this sort of once, I think, as I said to Chris, I think once you understand how the metrics work, then you can see that you can measure a whole range of things. But it's also really important to do it right. This isn't talk about how to be happy, or let's throw out GNP and just have happiness. I just don't buy that. But it is a talk about what these metrics can contribute to measuring progress, measuring human development, measuring things like effects of environmental quality. And also they can contribute in a serious way to public policy decisions. So I'll try and walk you through that with some references to the environment. I think as soon as you see how they work, you'll understand why they'd be good for this kind of thing. What's interesting, though, is where we are today versus where we were about 10 years ago. So I think in 2002, I published my first book on happiness at Brookings called Happiness and Hardship. It was about opportunity and insecurity in market economies. But the then director of economic studies at Brookings, who was a great friend of mine, Bob Lighton, said to me, this is a great manuscript, Carol. You've got to take happiness out of the title. Nobody's going to take you seriously. And he was probably right. He didn't sell too many books. He kept happiness in the title. About 6 months later, a big supporter of my work and collaborator in all this, Dan Kahneman, became the first psychologist to get the Nobel in economics. Behavioral economics started to explode, and this small group of us economists who were collaborating with psychologists working on happiness economics sort of grew. All of a sudden, it took off in academia, and so we went from really being laughed at by mainstream economists to a point now where you can't open an issue of the American Economics Review and see it, not see an article with happiness in the title. So, in terms of traction, measurement, robustness, academic significance, I think we've grown. But the other thing that's happened at the same time is that there is a lot of interest in using these metrics by governments and government statistics. So the UK has already included 4 well-being questions in its annual national statistics. I was part of the team that was involved in some of that design. The OECD also connected. In the end, it's a pretty small group of people, but the OECD has issued guidelines for statistics offices around the world. If you're going to collect these metrics, this is the way to do it. And it's one, so that people are using the same method. 2, so that people avoid obvious biases that we know about. And in the end, so that we'll have a base of statistics that could be comparable within and across countries and over time in the same way that GNP data are. And then even the U.S., which has been a little slower than others to pick up on this, we had a National Academy of Sciences panel on well-being metrics and policy, which was from about, I think it ran from 2011 to 2013. And we were very cautious in our recommendations, saying, the U.S. is so politicized. When our panel was announced, the Wall Street Journal wrote about it as an Obama government-funded effort to have the government tell you how to be happy, which was far from it. It's a bunch of real nerds that talked about measurement issues for days and days in rooms. But despite that caution, when we presented the report to the Committee on National Statistics, they were really excited about different ways that we could incorporate the metrics into different official surveys, and they are in some. Everybody says, is it in the census? When we met with the head of census, and he basically said getting a question into the census is the political equivalent of, raising taxes by 10%. And in the end, the census isn't the right venue anyway, because it's only taken every 10 years. And what you want to be able to see, if you're going to, say you're trying to do a study of the well-being effects of noise pollution or neighborhoods that haven't, or compare neighborhoods with leaf blowers and those without, you want to have you want at least a 6 months or 1 year time frame, but a 10-year time frame, there's so much else that could have happened that the data would not be useful. Anyway, so there's a lot going on. I'd like to run through as quickly as possible just some of the, how these things work, what are the basic things we find, and then talk about 3 questions that I think are key to policy, and particularly the middle question, I think really applies to the issue of trying to measure the effects of environmental quality or not. But the questions are why the particular definition of well-being matters. You can't just throw out happiness and that's it. I'm going to talk you through that. Then adaptation and progress paradoxes. And then the last is what's a meaningful change in well-being. So I will get to all those. I'd like to just briefly introduce the approach. That's shameless advertising. I actually should have my new book up there, but it isn't quite out yet. But I have a book coming out with Princeton Press called Happiness for All, ? And it's called Unequal Lives and Unequal Hopes in the Land of the Dream. And it's the first book I've written on the U.S., and it's about how divided we are and how the sort of lack of agency and expectations among the poor. It should be out in about 6 months. So, as I said, this has gone from a very nascent collaboration between economists and psychologists to a whole new approach in the social sciences, and now there's also a very strong interest in understanding the intersect between genes and the environment in determining well-being levels. So, because there is a distribution of well-being across people. People have innate character traits that influence all this and influence outcomes. So it's a little bit like the debate on, is it genes or the environment that determine IQ? It's sort of is it your innate character traits, or is it the things around you that determine your well-being levels? And we also know that people with higher levels of well-being have better outcomes. Again, I'm going to go through some of this. So it's become a collaboration which includes medical doctors and a whole range of academic disciplines. So it's a lot of fun, among other things. So with these metrics, we can answer questions as diverse as the effects of commuting time on well-being, why cigarette taxes make smokers happier. Believe it or not, they do, at least in Canada. Why the unemployed are less unhappy with higher local unemployment rates, and why people adapt to things like crime, corruption, and poor economic conditions. So the idea is that traditional economics is based on revealed preferences. You can't believe what people say because there's no consequence to what they say. They can say anything. So you can't use survey data, and what people say is inconsequential. You can only look at their revealed preferences via a choice, a consumption choice within a fixed budget constraint. The idea there is that, if you have a fixed budget constraint and you purchase something, you made a trade-off. So that's a real data point, right? Well, it turns out that works for some things, but we also know that there are a lot of consumption choices that are irrational. Like if you're addicted to cigarettes, you could be very poor and you're using up 90% of your budget on cigarettes. Maybe a cigarette tax makes you, helps you stop. If you think about that, how that works, then we're looking at it quite differently. Traditionally, we find, most of the time-use studies find that commuting time is one of the least happy time of day for most people. But traditional economics says, well, you made a revealed preference by buying this house very far away, and maybe you bought a really nice car to commute in, and it still doesn't make you enjoy your commute more in the end. And again, so you're getting a very different take, and the big departure from this approach is that we actually are listening to what people say. We're not saying, does commuting time make you unhappy? I'm going to explain to you how we do this, but we are looking at people's reported well-being, and then looking at how the other, all these other contingent things affect it. So the method is particularly well suited for answering questions that revealed preferences don't answer. I focus on two: situations where individuals don't have the agency to make choices, and or when consumption decisions are not the result of optimal decisions, but addiction, norms, self-control problems. So in terms of the first, think of macro and institutional arrangements individuals can't change through an individual revealed choice of preference. That could be, volatile, macroeconomic volatility. You really can't do anything about it as an individual and revealing your preference. It could be bad governance. I like to use the example of a poor peasant in Bolivia who's made unhappy by inequality. There's no way to observe the effects of that institutional arrangement on the peasant's choices. I mean, you could be voting for Evo Morales, but that's not doing anything about the arrangement. Versus if you can look at the well-being of somebody who lives with more or less inequality, holding all else equal, you get some insight. Another kind of arrangement like that is environment, airplane noise, whatever it is. So again, traditional economics would say, well, people chose to live near the airport because it was cheaper housing and that was their revealed preference. Well, maybe they probably would like to not live by the airport, right? But we don't know. I mean, and then another areas where behaviors are driven by very strongly imposed norms. Think of a poor person in India from a lower caste who doesn't send his or her child to school. Is that a choice, a revealed preference, or is that just a result of strongly imposed norms that say you're in a lower caste, your kid's going to be lower caste, schools are lousy, you have to incur uniform and book and other kinds of expenses. Maybe you just don't send that may make you very unhappy if you're a poor pet, in the lower caste in India, but we can't just observe the choice and infer what the welfare effect is. And then again, this sort of we find smokers are less happy than non-smokers, the obese are less happy than the non-obese. If you think about, but again, the revealed preference framework says you purchase cigarettes within your fixed budget constraint, that was your revealed preference. You chose to eat more food, and food is cheaper now, so you can eat more and more of it, and that's your welfare-enhancing rational choice. Well, we all know that most people aren't welfare-enhancing, future-predicting homo economicus, but rather there are all kinds of quirky things about human behavior that we can pick up on. And then the last point that I think is quite important, but also I can make this point much better now than we could 10 years ago, which is this survey data really worse than income data. So we now have so much more knowledge on question definition, biasing things, everything like question order bias to day of the week bias to, the right scaling, that these metrics are remarkably robust, and the patterns of the metrics across people and places are remarkably robust. And the idea that you can't, believe what people say, well, anybody who's, I don't know if any of you have ever worked with income data for developing countries, it's all based on household surveys. In a context where there's actually a consequence to reporting income that you don't pay taxes on because taxes are in flux, there's a lot more incentive to lie to a household income survey than to a happiness survey. What do you have to lose? So, in any event, and there's increasing consensus that this is actually credible data. Just something quickly about the terminology, because happiness gets the attention, and I have to admit to err putting it in my books because that's what sells books. But in the end, it's the least well defined of the terms we use. It gets the most public attention. It's in the Declaration of Independence. So it's an important concept, but from a measurement perspective, it's a little bit, one of the murkier terms. It attempts to gauge, when you ask people how happy are you with your life in general, it attempts to gauge how happy people feel about their life in general. And it doesn't impose a definition on respondents. And I think that's one reason we find that the patterns across China and Vietnam and Chile and Peru and the US and Canada are incredibly similar because people are defining happiness for themselves. The confusion lies in that there's, you can be happy at the moment. Are you thinking about momentary happiness? Or are you thinking about your life in general? So a better question is a life satisfaction question for if you're trying to get a sense of people's overall general life satisfaction. It correlates very closely with happiness, but it's a much better specified question. If you ask, in some instances, are you happy in general? It's sort of, is it now? Is it my whole life? It depends. If you ask somebody, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole, people think of their life course. Older people will look back, younger people will look forward. There's one difference there, but mainly, it's a more robust question. And that captures evaluative well-being. So this kind of broader sense of your life as a whole. Hedonic well-being or experience well-being is another dimension that we measure. It measures how people experience their daily lives. So what's their mood, positive or negative, smiling or worried, as they do different things like commuting, spending time with friends, or working. And so Kahneman, one of the things he was famous for was he gave all these people these beepers and followed them around. They beeped at different points at their time of the day, so he could measure their moods when they were doing all these different things. It turns out how you experience your life and how you evaluate your life are not always the same. So there's this famous Texas woman study that he did, where he found that even though everybody says their children are the most important thing in their lives, the time that these Texas women spent with their kids was the most miserable time of the day. Socializing with friends was the happiest time of the day. And what's interesting there, and here I confess to be biased and I'm being brought up in Latin America from a French Swiss mother, was that the French women did not have the same thing. I thought a little bit about it. I actually talked to Danny about it a bit too. And it's because I think in this country, it's like we're so focused on the kids that you're either driving down Rockville Pike for ballet lessons or soccer. It's just cuckoo. And in Europe and in Latin America, kids fit more just into a family. There's less of a kind of kid-centered focus. That's one thing, who knows what else. But the point is, there are also things about these two different well-being dimensions. The broader point is that there are things that you do in life that are purposeful and not pleasurable. And there are things that you do in life that are pleasurable but not purposeful, right? Say the latter, think about watching TV, which I don't particularly like, but occasionally a funny show is, just distraction, whatever it is. But you probably wouldn't put that in your, when you thought about your life as a whole, the funny TV show probably doesn't feature. There are times I have, well, they're now 17, but at one point I had baby twins and a 4-year-old, and at some levels of it was an absolutely magical time, and I certainly remember that, but there were times I was up literally all night and had to go give a talk or something, and I'm not sure how much fun that was, so there was or when you had 2 babies and a 4-year-old growing up with the flu, whatever it might be. So there are experiences that are unpleasant in your life, and yet when you think of your life as a whole or your life purpose, that's not what you're thinking about, right? You think about your children usually, and the same goes for people who are able to have long-term objectives, right? So if you have life purpose, if you want to achieve something, you may think about grad school, right? You undergo a few years that aren't maybe the most pleasant years of your life, but you're thinking of your life as a whole as you make that choice. So, in any event, we measure these two different dimensions of well-being, and both measures are relevant to things. If you wanted, for example, look at the well-being effects of different environmental arrangements or situations, you can imagine that you would use the different dimensions differently. If you were thinking about quality of life, and you wanted to know if people were enjoying their commute or whatever, or if is it better to bike than to be in a big car or something like that, you probably want to look at the daily experience dimension of things. If you're interested in a broader question of some overarching arrangement like emissions, CO2 emissions, or airplane pollution noise, or just pollution noise, whatever you wanted to look at, you then might want to look at life satisfaction. So you can do both depending on what you want to do. Just some of the main findings that sparked interest in this. This is a chart which has GDP per capita on the bottom, and then percent above neutral on the life satisfaction question on the vertical axis. It's a cross-country scatter plot. One of the things that sparked the most interest in happiness economics is an article that Richard Easterlin published in an obscure edited volume, edited by Mort Abramowitz in sort of essays on economic growth, some random publisher. It's one of the most read articles in economics, and it was called "Does Economic Growth Improve the Human Lot?" And what Easterlin did, he was the first economist, modern economist, to use happiness responses, and he found two dimensions of this paradox. One was over time, that as countries grew wealthier over time, average levels of happiness did not increase. So Japan quintupled its income in the post-World War period, and yet happiness levels fell. The U.S. grew more rapidly than any other country in the OECD up until 2001, and happiness levels were flat. I found in more recent data something I call the paradox of unhappy growth, where countries that are growing very rapidly, the sort of China's, Brazil's, Korea's, in their fast growth periods, you find life satisfaction rates actually skyrocket downward. China is the poster child. Suicide rates up, all kinds of really crazy stories. But so there's a sort of over time growth dimension to the paradox, and then there's a cross-country scatter plot, which is if you just look at a set of countries at any point in time, there isn't a linear relationship between happiness and per capita income. That said, there's a lot of debate now on this paradox, in part because it challenges some standard economic assumptions, but in part because it does matter how you measure it. So if you look at this chart, you could, if it were a room full of Brookings economists, we could probably argue whether there is or isn't an Easterlin paradox for the rest of the day on the basis of this one chart, and I never get to another slide. So the idea is that the wealthier countries are on average happier than the poorer countries, so you could say no Easterlin paradox. But when you look, within the sample of each, there's a huge amount of variance, right? And there's much more variance in the poorer countries. And why is that? That's because a lot of the things that contribute to higher levels of well-being in the aggregate are things like democracy, good public health, better environment, better social welfare systems. And the poor countries, some poor countries or poorer countries, have a lot of these things at lower levels of GDP than it was possible to many years ago. Latin America, and I'm from Peru, always scores very high on these metrics. There are a couple of reasons. I mean, one is a sort of natural cheerfulness that seems to, but two is the quality of life is actually really good in Latin America. Yes, there's guerrilla violence in a couple of countries, but overall, there are good family safety nets. There's a great appreciation for quality of life. They have democracies that function. They have national health care systems. They may not be perfect, but they have them. A lot of things about life in Latin America is actually really good. So they're about the same level of per capita income as all these Eastern European countries down here who are fairly miserable. So they're above what their income levels would predict, and the Eastern European countries are below. And having done a fair amount of work on safety nets in Eastern Europe, among other places, just walk up and down the streets and you explain this just from people's demeanor and cheerfulness. But part of that is a much more difficult legacy, a much more difficult transition into democracy. A lot of still sort of winners and losers, many other things. So at the same level per capita income, you can have very different levels of well-being. And down here you have countries which are objectively horrible places to live, and not surprisingly, they score very low on well-being. You know, Tanzania, Pakistan, Iraq, and Belarus.
Carol, for those of us in the back, what are the blue and orange? What is the key?
Non-OECD countries are blue.
Okay.
I don't even know why we did that, but so don't worry too much about it.
Okay.
So let's think rich and poor countries. But the other thing about this debate is I think it's fairly stupid. Now that I've talked this much about it, the reason being that we're very robust in measuring happiness is at the individual level, where we can control for all kinds of things, including individual character traits that can bias the way people respond. Here, all you're doing is taking an average of responses by country and comparing that to GDP levels. And so you aren't controlling, for example, for cultural differences in the way people answer surveys. So I was cheery Latin American, and I'd go around Paris with my mother and very dour Parisian grandmother, and learned very quickly that you didn't bounce into Parisian coffee shops and giggle and say you wanted a croissant. Versus I had a British friend who got so tired of being told to have a nice day when she went around the U.S. that she started saying, "Thank you, I have other plans." The point is they're just, and when people say they say have a nice day and throw your change at you. But the point is that there's certain norms about the way people answer things that bias responses up or down, and that's affecting these things. And then there's also naturally cheerful cultures, and that I would here also put the Latin American, Eastern European comparison. So, but where we're really more robust is at the individual level. And this slide will make you happy or not, depending where you are on it. That's happiness, and this is years of age. And what we found, this is actually, we're about to publish, I think, a fairly fundamental paper, because we've found that this holds in almost every country in the world. When the curve turns depends on average levels of happiness in the place. So people in happier places turn earlier, and also naturally happier people turn earlier. So some of the least happy countries with very low levels of life expectancy, like Russia, their turn is anywhere between 55 and 70. So these people don't even live together up here, right? And people in happier places get more happy life years, as do happier people. So what explains this? There are a number of things, some biological and some environmental. One is just kind of the middle age squeeze, right? People often have kids of various ages, elderly parents, often two jobs, whatever, in the same household, just financial burdens, whatever it might be. That's kind of what I would place as an environmental sort of factor. There's also an aspirations aligning with reality effect. And I think that's actually more biological. So by the time you're, in your late 40s, if you haven't figured out, if you don't play guitar and you haven't, you still want to be a rock star, you probably should align. And then there's that. There's also some work by psychologists that show that younger people have more emotional swings than older people, and older people are sort of wiser and their emotions swing less. Younger people, in economics terms, I would say, well, young people have a much higher standard deviation of bad experiences. So they have one bad experience, it's the end of the world. By the time you're over here, you've had so many bad experiences, you probably will survive unless you got hit by a car. So there are a lot of different things going on. There's also selection bias because in the same way that happier people turn earlier, happier people live longer, so the less happy people are dying off. There is a biological thing. A colleague of mine, Andrew Oswald, published a paper in Science on the U curve in apes well-being. So even orangutans have their cheerfulness goes down in the middle age of orangutan years, whatever that is. So there is some strong sense that there's something biological about it too. It's one of these regularities in well-being that allow us to control for that and look at the effects of things that vary, like environmental quality. So what else matters to happiness? Showed you age. Income does matter. You can't toss out income. People there are a lot of pro-gross national happiness people out there that say, oh, let's just we don't need income, we don't need GDP. Everywhere we've studied it, people within countries, people who are poor are much less happy than people who have means. How much is enough means is relative, and that there is this kind of competition for more and more that people seek and doesn't make them happier. It's complicated once people have sufficient means to lead the kinds of lives they want to lead. But until that, income really does matter to well-being. And it also matters to hedonic well-being, up to about median levels of income in the United States. If you don't have enough money, it's hard to have good moods. You're stressed a lot. It's just hard to experience your day. After that point, hedonic well-being and income don't correlate at all. So certainly, more and more money, a nicer car, all these things will not. The nice car may make you enjoy your commute more the first week you have it, and then the commute's going to stink just as much as it did before. Health is more important than income, though. So if you're going to look at the relative weights on the coefficients and the equations we use, health always comes out larger coefficient than income, which is not a surprise. Employment, everywhere we've studied it, even though the unemployed are more happy when there are more unemployed people around them, the unemployed are significantly less happy than the employed. Everywhere we've studied it. Marriage. Here's a finding that is a bit of an artifact of construction, which is probably not a nice way to talk about marriage, but the findings always show that married people are happier than non-married people when you're looking at a cross-section of data at one point in time. What is happening is happier people are more likely to marry each other, but the actual well-being effect of getting married lasts about 18 months. That's what the overtime data shows. But what you've done is you're comparing, these two happier people to the less happy people that didn't get married. There's a brilliant paper by my colleague Claudia Senig in Paris called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife," and they use overtime data, and they find that asymmetries in happiness levels are what is most likely to predict divorce. So it's better to have two happy people married to each other, two unhappy people married to each other, but you don't want, the other two driving each other crazy. Friendships go a little bit the same way. So people with more friends are happier, but happier people are more likely to make more friends. So we're much more robust when we have overtime data and tease out direction of causality, even though there's often two-way causality. But, and then gender, I'm not going to go into that because it just takes a while. It's basically women are happier than men in contexts that are, reasonable for women. I can talk about that more, but I don't want to go too on. Okay, I know you all don't want to see regression equations, but let me just explain how this works, because it's really important that you know what we're not doing. You don't have to really understand what we're doing. You have to know what not to do. So basically, we've run these equations with hundreds of thousands of people across country, across times. Our data sets are huge, which really allows us to tease out robust patterns. And you tease out in such large numbers, anybody could have a biased response on a particular day. They crashed their car, they broke up with their boyfriend, they failed a test, they won the lottery, all of those responses would likely be biased on that day. But when you've got numbers of this size, that noise is washing out. So we take the well-being of individual I at time t, whenever we're measuring it, and we control for what we call a vector of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, and these tend to have very stable patterns. They're what I showed you on the slide before: age, income, employment, marriage, health, status, location, urban, rural, all kinds of stuff. But the things that we know are consistent across a lot of contexts. And then once we control for those, we can look at the well-being effects of things that vary. And then the other thing is that there's a fairly large error term in these equations, which means what the equation didn't explain. It shows up in this error term. And that's because a lot of well-being is determined by individual innate character traits. Now that error term has helped us in some fancy econometrics where we've been able to isolate people's unexplained happiness, we call it. Residual happiness is only economists would, and see what that causes. And it actually does link to better health and better performance in the labor market. But the point for this is just when we say X or Y makes people happy or unhappy, or X or Y increases life satisfaction, or X or Y increases stress, worry, or anger, all these dimensions that we measure, we're not running around asking people, does corruption make you unhappy? Does leaf blower noise make you unhappy? Whatever it might be. We're controlling for all these other things, and then we compare the well-being levels of two otherwise similar people, one who lives in an airplane noise area and one who doesn't, that kind of thing. Or we can also look at people who smoke, people who don't smoke, people who exercise, don't exercise. As a distance runner, I'm happy to report people who exercise are happier. Probably if they run as much as me, they're nuts, but that's okay. So the point is, just seeing with this design, you could see the potential for exploring the well-being effects in either dimension of particular environmental conditions or changes in conditions. There's a chapter in my book called "Should We Have Bentham or Aristotle in the Statistics Office?" That's in this old book, but the idea is to tease out these two dimensions of well-being. Jeremy Bentham thought of happiness as maximizing the contentment and pleasure of the greatest number of individuals as they experience their lives on a day-to-day basis. That's what we call hedonic or experience well-being. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think there's more to well-being than that definition. The Benthamite sort of philosophy underlies utilitarianism and some of the quantified work in economics that focuses on welfare and utility are equal, and that's measured by an increment of income. Then Aristotle thought of happiness as eudaimonia, a Greek word that combines two concepts, eu meaning well-being or abundance, and daemon meaning the control of an individual's destiny. That latter part of well-being is something I work a lot on. It falls under the rubric of evaluative well-being, life satisfaction, those life course metrics that I talked about. It implicitly includes the opportunity to lead a purposeful and meaningful life. That's what we call eudaimonic well-being, and we're now actually measuring that explicitly. And it tracks fairly closely with evaluative well-being, but there are some differences. And the Brits even have a eudaimonic question in their national statistics, which is very cool. And then hedonic measures, the ones are, you're trying to see how people experience their day, their quality of life. And we measure those with simple questions like, were you happy yesterday, yes or no? Were you stressed yesterday, yes or no? You can also do those on a 10-point scale. And it's important with the hedonic metrics. So life satisfaction, it's not a cardinal scale, but it runs on one scale. So we know 1 is low life satisfaction and 10 is high life satisfaction. We know that 10 is not twice more than 5 because these things are categories and not cardinal numbers as people answer. But we know that it's a unipolar scale. Versus you can't put smiling yesterday at the top and worried yesterday at the bottom. The negative and the positive emotions are very distinct from each other, the positive emotions track quite closely with things like life satisfaction, but people can be very happy yesterday and very angry yesterday at the same time. And we found, for example, in the study of information technology around the world, that particularly in places where it was new and it was capability increasing, Africa, Latin America, in Africa people can e-bank and make financial transactions that they never could via the internet, that there was a positive effect on life satisfaction, but an increase in stress and anger, and fairly obvious why. So this whole issue of agency, people's ability to have some sort of control over their own life, is very important to me, I think, because I grew up in the developing world and I'm a development economist by training. But which dimension of well-being matters to particular people is in part determined by their capacity to make choices about the life course. So if you think about very poor people or people who live under very strongly imposed norms, women in the Middle East or whatever it might be, they may place more value on day-to-day experience because that's what they're able to do, right? Friendship, religion, and daily living can be a struggle, it can be very stressful, and it can lead to short-term time horizons. So then you do live in the day. There's a great book by Mullamathan and Shafir called Scarcity, and it shows that people who live with constant scarcity, constant risk, their cognitive ability to plan for the future is actually reduced over time. In my book on the United States, I'll show you a couple of data points demonstrating the extent to which the time horizons of the poor in this country, who live under very high stress, a lot of uncertainty, is much shorter. Their ability to plan for the future, invest in the future, believe in the future is compromised. So when people answer, if you just ask people, how happy are you in general, which is what we did when we started, we didn't know what we were doing, you get these surprises. That's things like I've called the happy peasant and frustrated achiever problem, where you get somebody who was in poverty and no change in their life, and they say, well, yeah, I'm happy. And then somebody was making changes and getting out of poverty, but expectations were raised, was trying to acquire agency, would report to be very unhappy. Now we break that down. Okay, speaking of stress. So this is some of the new work I'm doing. What's notable about this slide is this is Latin America and this is US. This is, did you experience stress yesterday, yes or no? Is not only do people in the US experience much more stress on a daily basis than Latin America, but this is the relevant point, is the gap between the poor and the rich in the US is so much larger. So the poor experience much more stress than the rich do in this country, and in Latin America, the stress is more equally shared. This one really shocked me. This is a belief in the future kind of question, and we're doing a lot of work, experimental work and other work, showing that if people believe in their future, they invest in it. And even interventions that give people aspirations and hope for the future can often change behavior. The beliefs and behavior channel is a really interesting one, but also a very real one. So this was, do you believe hard work will get you ahead in the future? This is the American dream. So in Latin America, it's pretty equally shared across cohorts. This is just a scatter plot, but we did fancy regressions and found that the income coefficient was insignificant in Latin America on belief in hard work. Look at the U.S. Huge differences. So the poor in the U.S. are much less likely to believe hard work will get them ahead than the rich in the U.S., than the poor in Latin America. The rich in the U.S., of course, are much more likely to think that hard work gets you ahead because they want to think hard work got them ahead, and it probably did get a lot of people ahead. But there's also something that this guy Lerner has written about called beliefs in a just world. So you want to believe that the world you live in is just, right? So particularly if you've succeeded in it. So there is kind of a reinforcing beliefs channel. But it's this data point that really struck me. And I think it has something to do with our very high levels of inequality as well. A quick thing, you can't read these numbers, but this is this issue of stress, which is a marker of poverty and a big marker of ill-being rather than well-being. So I had this thought that, or hypothesis, that there's different kinds of stress. So there's stress that's associated with goal achievement that may be temporarily unpleasant, but it's associated with things you can control, choices you've made. There's stress that's associated with constant, circumstances beyond your control and constant negative shocks. And I think that's got to be worse for well-being, right? And just think about, I thought a lot about when we did this evaluation of welfare mothers who went back to work during the back to work time. You think about a single female household with 2 kids, has a job that's not a nice job like it, Friends of the Earth or whatever, but tick-a-tock, do a time thing, and if you don't show up twice, you get fired and that's it. No health benefits anyway. You get a sick kid, you can't take the kid to daycare, you lose that job, right? Or your car breaks down. Not only do you not have the resources to fix it, but if you take the time to get it fixed, again, so there are these things about being poor and in uncertainty that we don't think about that much, but are really bad for well-being. So what I did in this regression is we have life satisfaction as a dependent variable and all the things you control for, and this is US data, and we had stress in there, but then we interacted stress with income and stress with education. So the coefficient on stress, I'm sorry this is too small, but the coefficient on plain stress is very large. It is indeed, the negative effect of stress is 4 times more than the positive effect of income on life satisfaction. But when we interact stress and household income, you get a mitigating effect. It doesn't take it away, but you really get a mitigating effect, and the same for education. The idea being that stress for people who have control over their lives is very different from stress for people who don't. And this is another thing we did, which is I've been reading a lot, writing a lot, and thinking a lot about the effect of our increasing levels of inequality and their links to stagnation in our mobility rates and what drives all this, right? I mean, there's the idea that you need some inequality to reward productivity and innovation, but there's a fair amount of consensus now that the amount of inequality we have now is corrosive to democracy and other things. Well, it turns out it's also corrosive to belief in the future and the aspirations of people at the bottom end, because the top is too unachievable. So we looked at inequality across U.S. MSAs. So those are metropolitan statistical units. They're bigger than zip codes, smaller than states. And the idea is that inequality affects people at a lower level of reference than at the country level. It's too vague. But you know how people around you live, right? And there's a big difference in inequality across U.S. localities in the same way that there's a big difference in mobility rates across U.S. So what we found is that places with more unequal MSAs in the U.S. had more levels of stress on average, but it was very much driven by the differential between the rich and the poor. So the poor had more stress in more unequal places. That's just a little map, which is not, it will take too long, but I can send you this PowerPoint if you want to see them where they are. The most unequal places are Vero Beach, Florida, the New York, New Jersey corridor, a couple of other places. I think California may have had one. The more equal places are places like Wobegon in Minnesota. Wait, what do I do here? So anyway, enough on that. But it is there's the idea is that there are things about inequality that contribute to all this, and I would be very interested if anybody had some thoughts on are more unequal places greener or less green. My guess would be less green unless they're gated communities, but I can't answer that. We also found that the higher inequality places had less reported social support, both among the poor and the rich. So even the rich felt they had less social support in more unequal places. Very quickly, the adaptation conundrum. This is relevant to anything that you might do measuring environmental stuff. Adaptations are psychological defense mechanisms. There are means to preserve psychological well-being. They can be humor, sublimation. They can be bad ones, such as schizophrenia or paranoia. But it is a way to preserve your own well-being. People adapt to tough stuff. Particularly, they're better able to adapt to unpleasant certainty than to uncertainty. So that's why you get these happy peasants. They lead very simple lives, they have short life expectancy, their kids are likely to die of a preventable disease, but that's a certain reality and they've adapted to it, right? The problem with adaptation, from my perspective as a economist, development economist, is that if everybody adapts, they don't push for change. They adapt to bad governance. They adapt to horrible environments. There was this great TV interview in Lima, it must have been 15 years ago. I don't think they've solved that a little bit anyway, where they were interviewing the minibus drivers, and everybody takes these minibuses. They're informal taxis, jamming, so many people. There are people hanging off the back, and they all emit black smoke. I mean, just the most incredibly, awful old cars with them. And they were asking one of the drivers about black smoke, and he goes, "What black smoke?" I mean, it's just, So people adapt also to poor norms of health and report to be healthy. People in Kenya are as satisfied with their health as people in the United States. It just doesn't make sense. People in Guatemala are more satisfied with their health than people are in Chile. And that's just about adaptation and low expectations. Let me show you one slide, and then I'll try and wrap up. This is a great adaptation story about this whole issue of unpleasant certainty versus uncertainty. This is daily data from the Gallup Healthways. I'm an advisor to Gallup, so I get all their data. But so the blue line is the Dow. The red line are average levels of life expectancy in the United States. 2008 January to 2010, the financial crisis, right? So what happens when that's Lehman Brothers collapses, the Dow tumbles. Average levels of happiness also tumble, almost following the Dow, with the two spikes: Obama's inauguration day and Valentine's Day. And this is data for every day, so we can tell you what happens on an exact date. We even had Michael Jackson's death in there at one point. But in any event, what happens? If you all remember, in March of '09, the bottom stopped falling out of the markets. There was this period where everybody was just, am I going to lose my house? Am I going to lose my retirement? Is the U.S. economy going to collapse? Is the world economy going to collapse? And all of a sudden the markets just stabilize and sort of slowly sputter up. Look at average levels of well-being. They go up higher than they were before. These same people are saying that their economic situation is worse. But then you can adapt to a certain loss, and particularly in the financial area, much more easily than, say, in the family arena. So when you think about places that have crappy environments in many dimensions, but that's what people are used to, they may not report. You may find that you don't get the life satisfaction bump down that you think you would. The same holds for studies of weather. The city of Santa Monica did when they measured well-being. So they asked 4 questions. So this is not expensive to include in a national survey. Happiness or life satisfaction, a general evaluative question. 2 hedonic questions, a negative and a positive one. Remember I said so they had smiling yesterday, and then they had stress or worry. They played around with them. And then they had a eudaimonic question: do you have purpose or meaning in your life? And they had them all on the same scale every year. That's a good basic starting point. There's some questions that we haven't answered, and one is this issue of cardinality versus ordinality. So we know, that these people don't. We know how the scales work. They're almost cardinal in nature, but we don't. There really aren't numbers on these scales. So how do you weight? Do you weight differently from a policy perspective? Should we focus on reducing suffering? A lot of people in the field think we should. So giving miserable people a higher weight, giving a higher weight to raising somebody who's at 1 to 3, so from misery to less misery, or raising aggregate levels, and do we even worry about the 8s and the 9s? Do we care if they get to 10, right? But so that hasn't really been discussed much, but I think if you're going to think about well-being indices influencing policy, I think we really do have to answer those questions and have those discussions. And the answers may vary across contexts. The other is what's a meaningful change in well-being. So, we know as scholars that if the US goes from an average well-being of 6 on a 10-point scale to 7.2 in 1 year, that's a lot of people increasing their, that's a very significant change. If we reported that figure to the public, they wouldn't know if it was good or bad. They'd have no way to read that metric. And it doesn't mean they need a full-blown education. They have to get used to the metrics, which has happened in Britain. I mean, that's taken some time. The average Joe on the street knows that a 1% increase in the unemployment rate is a bad thing. They know, you know, if they read that it goes up by 0.1%, so what, right? They couldn't tell you how many people actually moved in or out of employment under either scenario, right? And it's a small amount of people. Even with 1%, it's 1% of the unemployed pool. But the metric is meaningful because people have learned to listen to it. And so that's something that still needs to happen. I mean, there's a deeper philosophical question of what's a meaningful change in well-being, and I would answer that as somebody going from only being able to have kind of the daily experience dimension of well-being to having agency and the capability to choose the kind of life they want to lead. But that's my normative opinion. That's not, you know, anything. Okay, and then lastly, you know, happiness, well-being is more complicated than income. It took us a long time to get GNP right, and there's still debate about what should be in it, what shouldn't be in it, what it measures badly. You know, it weighs pollution creating activities as positive, and it doesn't count them as negative. So it's going to take a while to get these metrics perfect. I don't think they'll ever be perfect. We've gone a long way. We're not only not far away from a world where governments around the world are collecting these metrics, but they are already. And I think that they're most useful in complementing GNP metrics. I really don't think you can use only these metrics without objective income indicators. And what's also happening is at the micro level, a lot of cities, states, Vermont, city of Portland, I think, or Seattle, Maryland, have tried to measure well-being at the more local level, and this is occurring all over the world. So the city of Santa Monica, which Chris asked me about, implemented an index of well-being. They're run out of the mayor's office. They were amazing. They called in a bunch of academic advisors, including me, the top people in the field, to advise them on what to do, what not to do, and they were able to produce a really nice index where they also looked at domains like people's satisfaction with their work and their environment and all kinds of other things. And what's useful about the local level measures is that what I found is that you can tell everybody that smoking's bad for you. If you tell them that smokers are less happy than non-smokers, they wake up because it's just a more personal thing. It's not this vague, you know. So when you add that to using those metrics in a community where the people listening know that it's about their community. This isn't like, you know, inequality makes you unhappy. Well, where? What? It doesn't affect me. It's here. And so they found things about like how much people use their green space and worries about inequality, all kinds of things that they will then not only, I think, inform the municipalities' efforts, but really created some public discussion. It's still new. It's new, you know, very new right now, and I think it'll take a couple of years, but I think they're going to find it's a really useful tool.
Yay!